want to start with saying hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Josefin Westborg, and I will be your host tonight. And this roundtable is brought to you by the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University, the Department of Game Design. The Transformative Play Initiative focuses on role-playing games as a vehicle for change. All of our panelists here have held talks for us as part of this event series. For those of you that have missed any of the talks, I will give a short presentation of our guests and what they have talked about, but you can also find all of the talks at our YouTube channel. So our wonderful panel today consists of Whitney, Strix, Beltran, a depth psychologist working at the project as a project narrative director at Hidden Path Entertainment. She talked to us about designing character ensembles for player catharsis. We also have Johanna Koljonen, an experienced designer, theorist, and strategic consultant that works at the Participation Design Agency, of which she is also a co-founder. Her talk was about the personal and the political, playing and designing for transformation in Nordic LARP. Then we have Diana J. Leonard, an associate professor of psychology at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. In her talk, Playing for Pain, she focuses on benefits, pitfalls, and strategies for role-playing marginalized characters. Then we have Jaakko Stenros, a university lecturer in game studies at Tampere University. He presented for us on Why Do Humans Play? Exploring the functions, benefits, and meanings of play and dark play. And our last panelist is Alan Turner, who teaches game and design at DePaul University and runs the DePaul Original Game Studio. In his talk, Disrupting Monkey, Laughing Raven, The Magic of the Trickster's Dance, we got to know the archetype of the trickster and how it can function as a world builder. So that is our fantastic panel. Hi and welcome, everyone. I would love to start this off with, for us and the audience to get to know you a bit better. So I will ask you to describe a transformative experience that you have had as a result of engaging in role-playing games. So, Alan, would you like to start?
Hi. Yeah, so I actually talked about this a little bit in my, well, I lost myself. I talked about this a little bit in my my talk, where one of the biggest standout transformative moments for me was my best friends, Bill, we had like this D&D group, right? And we've been playing D&D since end of high school, beginning of college. We're like the kids from, the heck was that show? Stranger Things. And so we all kind of took turns game mastering and doing games for each other. So we had like this coalition of characters that had married each other and done all kinds of crazy stuff. And, you know, they're all high level and whatnot. Bill had begun, Bill was really, really sick. He had begun a new campaign, and in that campaign, I started playing this character, Callias, who was a priest of a death god. And the whole focus was to kind of figure out what it was like to play a character who served death in a game like D&D, where the entirety of the game kind of revolves around death as being a bad thing. And the game was slowly making allowances for like the idea of a gentle repose cleric, but it was really hard to find ways to engage the character the way I wanted, being this neutral good god, priest of death. So I would have these regular conversations with Bill about, you know, how death plays out in the world, you know, how can I be a psychopath, how can I usher souls in, and we did all of this real kind of deep diving about just the cosmology of the world. It was a Forgotten Realms campaign, but the cosmology of the world around just death. And then Bill died. He had a renal failure. He had severe diabetes and a failing kidney. And we were waiting for him to show up at another game. He never came to the game. went to go check on him. Well, called him much times, and he wasn't there. So eventually, myself and my ex-roommate went to go check on him, and we eventually got the fire department to knock his door down, and there he was, dead on the ground. And in the moment where I saw him there, this interesting thing happened where the character that I had been playing, this Callias, kind of took over. It was like I was being ridden by a Loa, and all the conversations we had about death and dying and making space and all this stuff just started rolling through my head, and I immediately just kind of fell into that role. So it was a kind of a character bleed moment, and my buddy, it was too much for him to handle, and he left. But I wound up having to help wrap the body up, help the police carry him down three and a half flights of stairs, put it into the coroner's wagon, then went back upstairs and cleaned his apartment. Getting rid of all the blood and bile because he had a very violent struggle on his way out, to prepare the space for his mother, and then sat with his mother when she came back in. But the entire time I was doing that, I was less Alan and I was more Callias. And then after the funeral, after we buried Bill, there's something about Callias that just kind of got absorbed into me as a tool set, and it's still there. And the character got retired. But yeah, I remember that, and it's a very, very huge resonant moment in my life, because it was like, if I hadn't had that time with him in that character beforehand, I don't know that I would have had the wherewithal to make that adjustment and deal with that critical moment when it appeared to me. So yeah, yay games.
That's super intense. Thank you for sharing that with us. So, Diana, do you want to go next?
Sure. Is it okay if I give something more general than a specific moment? Okay. I think that with my two recent LARP characters, I've explored different emotional tones in a way that has been transformative for me. My first character that I'm thinking of was a way to explore my anger and sensuality as somebody who had become professionalized as a college professor and scholar. I'm very much in my head, not in my body. And that was something that I struggled with and that I knew that I didn't like. And I wanted to use this LARP character to explore being more passionate, exploring my strong feelings of anger and frustration at social injustice through this character who was a dissident poet who basically spoke openly and angrily about society and how it had wronged her people in a way that I didn't at the time as a pre-tenured faculty member feel that I could be open with, even though I'm discussing topics of race and identity and oppression. I can't necessarily show how upsetting it is to my students in the classroom, or at least I didn't feel at the time that I could. So I was very much, I feel like, silenced, but and not constipated is the word that I can think of right now. Kind of just like bottled up. There we go. And this character allowed me to open the bottle, and that was amazing. And also see that the power that anger has, but also the that it can be barbed and that it can hurt people. And so just playing around with an emotion that I hadn't expressed. And then this was actually also intentional because I LARP away from my home. So I wanted to kind of flip um, the energy that I was portraying to people that I socialized with only through the LARP experience, because I felt like that was starting to tinge the way that they saw me. So I then decided to mix it up and play a character who was just like an open heart. We call it what is it, a muffin? Why can't I think of uh anyway, she was just very sweet, innocent, loves everyone, puts her heart on her sleeve, and unplanned by me, she actually experienced a lot of grief and loss, and powerlessness through the course of her story. And so she began to openly, I feel like I cried more in character as this person than as myself my whole life. And that too was a powerful lesson and a transformation, because it taught me that grieving and showing your pain openly to others actually brings people closer together, and that they will see you not as weak but as strong through your resilience of that pain. And that was a really powerful lesson for me also at that time. And also a run up to the pandemic. It was the last character I played before the pandemic started, and I think it was a really important character to play before this global experience of pain and grief that we've had, to be able to scaffold how I was going to manage that in the next coming years. So yeah.
Thank you. I would say that was also pretty personal, not so overarching, and very relatable. I have been there, making calls to my mom, talking about how I cried all weekend at the LARP, and she said, "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry." No, it was amazing.
Oh, can I jump in real quick? And that character, I experienced anxiety, and that character, I never felt anxiety a moment when I was playing her, because I think she was more about everyone else. Let me take care of everyone else, and not so self-focused, and that's awesome.
Thank you. Jaakko?
I have sort of 3 moments that I'd like to sort of briefly mention, not diving into them too deeply. But these are sort of things that have changed me somehow. The first one was back in 1999. I participated in this LARP called Ground Zero about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the first time a LARP really hit and made an impact, and that was where I understood the power of this expression. And I mean, as a person who has then turned it into a job, that was very transformative for me. That was the moment where sort of I kind of found my path. A few years later, in 2003, I played a LARP called Mellan Himmel och Hav in Sweden, where part of the pre-LARP workshop, we went through a lot of sort of queer feminist sort of thinking, as well as sort of all kinds of sort of assembly building exercises. And although the LARP was excellent, the thing that really had an impact on me was some of those workshops that preceded the LARP, where standing in circle, sort of looking at the other players into the eyes and being emotionally naked, I felt that for the first time that I have value as a person. And that was sort of this moment of being seen and seeing myself also as valuable. And then the third one is from 2011, Just the Loving, that I played in Norway, which is about the HIV crisis hitting the gay community in New York. It was the first time that LARP was played, and the first time that I played in a gay LARP. And that was a sort of striking experience in the sense that of being seen and seeing those stories as valid, as something worth exploring and something worth playing out, and sort of giving that attention and that mind, that sort of when I was growing through those times, that sort of having a connection to it, but now looking at it from a completely different angle. And also it gave me an appreciation for life, sort of going through those experiences and sort of getting that sliver of an understanding of what it might have been like, then sort of seeing the value in what I have. So maybe those moments I would pick out.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Strix, would you like to share?
Yeah. How do I follow all those stories? So for me, LARPing in particular was incredibly transformative in my late teens, early 20s, in a way that is actually kind of hard for me to articulate. Sarah's heard this story, but I will generalize in that I was a pretty traumatized individual when I was younger. But the issue that was that my pain was secret. Like nobody knew what I was feeling really at all. And that grew into me not knowing what I was feeling really at all, ever. And when you try to have human connections in that environment, you can't. So it's very isolated. I didn't know how to interact with other people authentically or to show them any of myself because it was dangerous. Secrets would come out. And I was, stifled and very, very unhappy and not doing well. And what I found was pretty much as soon as I got into gaming, that I sensed in kind of just like an intuitive way that this was a space where it was safe to not talk about the secrets, but to actually be adjacent to the material and to start to do a type of shadow work. I had no idea what the term shadow work was at that time. Like, it just didn't exist. But I gravitated towards these experiences, and there was a wrong-running Legends of the Five Rings LARP. Now, I know Legends of the Five Rings, it's got a lot of issues culturally, and it's not the greatest. It's not a very sophisticated system, but it was a vehicle that worked for me in that I was able to mimic vulnerable relationships and having feelings of trusting and loving and being vulnerable to other people. That was like a tremendous breakthrough for me, actually. And I got to sort of play with it in this space first and go, okay, that didn't kill me. I am not dead. And, you know, a part of my brain doesn't know what the difference is between LARPing a thing and experiencing the thing. So part of me just experienced the thing for the first time. And I was able to integrate that, absorb it into my full personality in my life successfully, and really start to grow as a person after that, and engage much more authentically in like human relationships, and ultimately start my journey towards healing, you know, all of the what we now know as PTSD in my life. And I'm still on that journey, but I think without the embodied, the physical experience of playing these characters and getting to test out these human emotions, I would be in a very different place.
Thank you. And I think it's amazing that you could get to start that journey that early compared to, at least to me, that started way later. I think that's amazing that role-playing could be part of making that happen. So then, Jok, what is your thing to share?
I'm realizing, listen to two things listening to everybody else. One is that I'm just, ask me again in 10 years, you know, I've been LARPing since the mid 90s, but I sit real tight on my racket, you know, like I've probably been using LARP in a sort of subconscious way as a very sort of disciplined artistic practice, precisely because I am not very chill about allowing transformation in myself. The other thing I realized is that I played those 3 LARPs that Jaakko mentioned, and they've all been really important to me, but specifically sort of not in that way, for different random and or identity related reasons. And that's a whole other thought that I'm going to go on. But the one I was going to mention kind of connects to this, which is quite recent. And it's going to sound like a very trivial thing. Karin Nirvan, who I think is here today, designed a LARP called Vedergällningen, which The Vengeance, which I think I played in 2019, and it's running again next year. And it's set in this sort of pseudo-historical Viking village of Völvas, or non-male magic users, and it's an environment which is dominated by it's like a female norm, and then there is a ship of Viking raiders who have been through a terrible time, who come there for advice, and then this sort of masculine normative group barrels into a place where they are now not the norm, and then there are things like dynamics occur from that. And I was asked to play on the village sort of council, which is sort of a council of elder women, of course, with a bunch of amazing grown-up players. And in a way, like the trivial surface answer to your question is that was it. I think that was in 2019, and I think that was the first time in my life when I was in an environment where mature women, I mean, I remember that as all of the players on as well being like 40 plus at least, on that maybe they weren't. That's how I remember it. That all of these deciders in these rooms were doing, and we were doing it with processes that were intentionally not like what's happening outside. But then I'm easily bored, and one of the things that really drives me nuts is like LARP meetings. where you have like pretend ruling is happening and you're having this sort of expositional conversations where you're also sort of meta managing plot content. That just drives me nuts. That is not what I'm there for. So how can I make sure that if this happens at this LARP, it didn't, but I thought it might, how do I not do that? And at the spur of a moment, I decided that I would play a non-verbal character. To anyone who has ever met me, it's like an absolutely insane proposition. Because this idea that I would be mostly quiet for 3 days is bizarre. And of course, the only reason I could do that was that I had done a spectacularly stupid decision and played 2 very intense LARPs back to back. So I had just come out of a LARP called Baphomet, which is designed by Björk Pedersen and Linda Udby. So, and that whole LARP is about this sort of a cult that sort of draws down the wrong thing, and you spend 3 days in a very sort of beautiful interaction engine deconstructing civilization. So you go into a character and go through the physical experience of deconstructing character and becoming something very primal, slept for 20, like traveled to the next venue and went straight into play Vera. I do not recommend this. This is not good practice, especially not if you have like mental health stuff like I also do. That's just nuts. But it was like I used the first LARP accidentally as a workshop for the second LARP, and I had gotten into my body in a state kind of for the first time in my life, possibly where I could be nonverbal for 3 days. And that allowed me to connect to that female community and those non-male experiences and those ways of doing power in a way that I had never experienced before. So even though it's like a little intellectual, it's almost like, you know, it's like a future simulation, right? I have now lived in a world where these norms are different. And that was very powerful. But to be able to do that, I had to be in this body in ways that are super uncomfortable to me normally. And it worked fine. Yeah. And I still had to scry, like I had to speak the future. So I invented this like weird, also spur of the moment, I invented this like reverse magic where if you wanted me to tell you something, you had to choke me safely, of course. But there was this strange power dynamic where I have this enormous magical power of these people, but placing yourself in a physical thing where they can restrict your voice and then you can speak. And like, it was just like random spur of the moment game design, but all of that worked out very, very beautifully. And as you can hear, I'm not great at shutting up, so I'm just going to shut up now for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know this, but I do know you, and wow. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to do that myself. But you actually brought something up that I found very interesting, that I would love to hear from you about, all of you. I'm actually going to overrule now and say, if you want to start to talk, please just raise your hand and I'll be able to see it, and so we don't have to be too strict with order and so on. But you mentioned that sometimes you feel that it might be hard for you to be open for transformation. And I think this is really interesting because there are apparently barriers here to transformation. So what barriers to transformative play overall have you noticed? And do you have any thoughts about how to overcome these that you want to share with us? Or spur on. I see the thinking going on here. Yes, Strix, please share.
Yes, so I think this is a complex question that will have a lot of different answers. For me personally, I am just instinctually transformational seeking, like I just go for it. But not everybody is like that. And I think we can actually kind of borrow and learn from psychedelic experiences. I promise I know where this is going, about set and setting, right? Which is you have the correct mindset and you have the correct environment, or at least positive environments that encourage you towards transformational experiences. So, workshops often help do this in LARPs where you get your head in the right place, though that doesn't work for everybody. And then the actual physical space or the emotional environment or even the world building environment of LARP itself, I think they all contribute. And I think all of us in games are borrowers. We're curious and we steal things from everywhere. And I think this is an instance of like stealing from another countercultural community, on things that they've been doing for a very, very, very long time and going, ah, that applies here too.
Thank you. That's actually super interesting. For me, that's very far away, but I'm like, yeah, that's a great point. Yes, Jock.
Yeah, it's that what you just said there, Strix, it makes me just think that why does that sound so alien to me? And I think that part of it is, I just heard myself say before that I approach LARP as a sort of very disciplined practice in a way, which sounds, because we do so many things that are totally nuts at LARP, but like to me, it is really this sort of, the practice of role playing is very much about being in the present, right? It's about focus very much. I think that to be able to LARP, you have to be, I find myself, even after very physically exhausting LARPs, I find myself very rejuvenated. Just from because the practice, it's kind of mindfulness practice to be, it's a mindfulness practice for people with a ton of ADHD, I think, is to be in the present and to you have you're processing data, especially over time as you get more skilled, you're processing data on so incredibly many levels at the same time, internally and scanning yourself and externally and in the space and so on. And so I think that in some ways, even though I literally never thought about this, which is weird until today, to me, LARPing is quite a lot about control. It doesn't feel that it's, but control in the way where the goal is a flow state. It's kind of Buddhist control, if you see what I mean. And I think that I also have many, many friends who I LARP with for a long time who are kind of the opposite, that it's not about maintaining sort of sets of limits to create this sort of, so for me, it's about creating this space where I can allow my emotions and body and the narrative journey and my like storytelling powers to do very powerful things in a sort of controlled, contained way. Like I build up a kind of pressure that drives, and others are very much about like bringing down, limits or like collapsing out, my emotions are collapsing into the story, and that this is not about bleed, this is about something else. This is like a performance practice somehow, except on the inside. I don't know, I don't have any words for this, which is fascinating. Yeah, but also I'm interested in what you're saying. So like in a practical sense, I also think that sometimes I have kind of been the trip sitter for people at LARPs who play in that incredibly like effusive, emotionally limitless way, that I'm like, okay, no, you're
because
fine.
They can get lost, right?
Yeah, right. So I'll think, yeah, you're probably fine to play this LARP, but only if somebody is looking out for you, this way of playing. And I think that there are some consent problems, like very fundamentally, in using LARP in a very intentional way to deal with your crap. And I say this is again as someone with a lot of crap undealt with. But so it's also a little bit about that. But there's something about because we don't have language for this. It's difficult to negotiate, I find. So that also, but then you can make these partnerships with other people to take care of each other.
Yeah, so sorry, I just want to jump in again because you said something really interesting about consent and people purposely probably we would call doing shadow work, dealing with their crap, with people who are maybe unaware or unconsenting to what they intend to do. And that is a problem because it can be weird and dangerous in different ways. It can be dysregulating for the people around them. And like, at the end of the day, LARPs are about having an experience that is valuable, right? Sometimes we call it fun, sometimes we call it enriching, sometimes we're like, that was a downer, but I learned a lot. But it has to have value. And if someone else takes the value away from you because you're too busy dealing with their crap, then that's not okay, right? And I think this is where we do need more language, we do need more research, and we do need a lot of more support around when is it okay this work, when is it not okay to do this work. How do we get consent? When do we get off of the consent train when it's not working in the middle of a scene? And also, like, do we design specific LARPs for specific things and we make it really clear that's what this is for, or do we not? For me, in my early experiences, what I was talking about is like, I had no idea what I was doing. It was not really conscious what I was doing, but it was really useful. And I think back to like, did I hurt anybody? I don't think so. Did I make the game unfun for anybody? I don't think so, but maybe it could have easily gone that way. And like when we're dealing with our psychic contents, right? It's so wild and unpredictable. I don't know. This is like the Wild West. It excites me, but it's also really complex.
Alan, please.
So Strix actually said a lot of what I wanted to say. But I guess an related note, in addition to, I guess, consent, there's this idea of permission. I think permission is a huge part of getting people to kind of come into those deep spaces where, at least when you're not mindful of it, I think a lot of us wind up, when the shadow work happens, when like the transformation is happening, it's kind of accidental, right? We just kind of stumble down that rabbit hole. But for myself in particular, in my younger days, it didn't happen for me until people within my group would invite me to do something outside of the, I'm going to call them the trauma roles that I played on a regular basis, that I played out in my game. So like I had, coming from an abusive household, I had a real big thing about being a good boy, right? And not doing things that would bring pain and harm and emotional junk. So I had this tendency to always try to just play the goodest of the good characters. And it wasn't until some of the people in my circle suggested to me I should try playing an evil character one day. and it was actually a huge hurdle for me to do that. I had to I had to have permission from them to be evil. And then I had to kind of dig into like, what is this evil about? And it started off just being kind of wahaha bad guy, but then it quickly turned into a strategic, a victim strategic vengeance kind of thing, right? Where I started to the pieces of me that I was always holding back, I kind of let out and I let it kind of run wild, but in such a way that I actually got kicked out of the game because my evil was too good. People got so caught up in trying to catch me doing bad things that it was derailing the rest of the game. So they had to say, Alan, this character now has to be an NPC because we can't. It's just not working. So, but the freedom that came with that, right? Just having the group tell me it's okay to try this thing, and then having them be able to have conversations with me where they separated Alan in the outside world from Alan inside the game world, and that I could explore with their permission that stuff. And then there's also a barrier that people are willing to kind of say, whoop, you hit the boundary, let's back up and pull out. But I think when a lot of the times, when we sit down and play games, especially when you're doing like a game, and this is less LARPing and more tabletop, but you're doing a game like at a con, you don't really have the trust. You don't have the knowing and understanding of the people at the table with you. So it's really hard to get that permission from people. And even if someone's saying, hey, this is going to be a meaningful game, it's still really hard to kind of find both the consent, the trust, and the permission in that space. So figuring out ways to bring that to the table and get people to kind of buy in the moment, I think is huge. And I think there's a whole lot of stuff that does a good job of doing that. I feel like in LARP spaces, there's a little more than there are tabletop spaces. In tabletop spaces, we have more things to catch a problem, right? We've got like the X cards and all that kind of stuff. We've got things that keeps people from being assholes. But there's not a whole lot that kind of open space that says, okay, what's the deep, beautiful portion of you? Let's play it out. These are my experience so far.
Thank you. I'm just going to mention for all of you, so you know that when you raise your hand, you also have to click again to take it down, or it stays up, just so you know. I'm actually going to jump in here and ask Diana to follow up on this.
Yeah, I actually wanted to respond to something specific that Alan was saying about feeling like it's difficult to build that trust in a short, I heard a little bit short-term convention space, people you don't know very well, and that maybe there are ways that we can scaffold that through workshops, which is what Strix mentioned. And then, so as somebody who primarily plays 2 to 3 year long campaign LARPs in communities that are persistent over the 10, 20 years, you would think that I'm going to come in and say, that's the answer, right? Be in these communities where you've built this trust. But unfortunately, I'm here to say that that comes with its own set of barriers, I think, including that any community, as we know is going to be fraught with internal drama and interpersonal conflict, which can become even more exacerbated when there's in-character conflict that could be kind of hitting the same groove. So I think that that can be a barrier too when you do have persistent communities that even if you have positive associations with the folks you're playing with, it can run counter to the role that they're trying to portray and that you're trying to portray with them. It can cut in and get in the way of transformative play. So just wanted to hold space for that. All of it presents challenges, just different challenges. Yeah.
Thank you. Jok? Or have you just not?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just actually kind of following up on both Strix, but I think Strix specifically, you asked these questions, which I thought was super interesting. Did my process, which I didn't do on purpose, like did it make the space less fun for others? So did I make it perhaps even unsafe for others? And you don't think so. And I think one of the reasons we know, or like one of the reasons you're able to answer that question is that we do have there are things which I suppose in particular at the time we perhaps hadn't specifically verbalized, but about play cultures, and there are certain norms. Certainly now we have like norms around calibration and around people signaling to you in different ways when play is becoming difficult for them. But I find that, of course, one of the most difficult times to set those boundaries for myself as a player when I'm feeling the other player is in need or in pain, that this is about something that is outside this is not quite in their control, and then it's very difficult to set those boundaries. But then again, like there's a position where very rapidly, or a friend, just like in some other part of the LARP, someone you know has a difficult time and they need you, and even if it weren't in a good time for you, it doesn't matter. Like that stops mattering at the time when you have to help another human or get to help another human. So that's actually like fine. But yeah, I think more like fundamentally there's something also in this form, at least in the cultures where I play role-playing games, whether at table or in LARPs, that the creating the things that we do together, the role-playing is between us, like that we are in that it's this sort of space where we have certain agreements, and that one of those agreements is that it can't always be just about me. So while you are doing that work, if it's happening within, like if there's an actually quite strict kind of frame around what kinds of things we are doing together here, like that we have some idea of collective responsibility for everybody's experience or the story or whatever is in the focus in your particular play culture, as long as we really treat those as kind of sacred, then I think all the emergent stuff, as long as we have calibration tools, that we can handle. And that's why, because a lot of people, when they learn about this stuff, they're like, why don't you have more problems? Like, how haven't your communities killed people? How haven't your communities created terrible, psychiatric crises for people? A lot of the time, like that really happens incredibly rarely. And the answer has to be built into the form somehow, because we were not skilled 20 years ago with any of this stuff. So it has to be inherent somehow. Jaakko is laughing, so let him take over.
Yes, please do. Go ahead. I want to hear.
I was just sort of pondering the question of sort of what are the barriers to transformation, and to me it seems like sort of there are at least two obvious barriers. Where one of these is unsafe practices. So if I don't feel safe enough to play, if there's no trust or openness, room to feel, that's going to be a barrier. But at the other end, I think we also have sort of if I play with the same group of people in a familiar way, year after year after year, the same game, there's not going to be much transformation there either. So like Alan was saying, a surprise is needed. Something surprising is needed in the mix for any real kind of transformation to happen. And I'm not sure if consent is the right sort of framework to think about this thing, because I don't think you can have informed consent for transformation. I don't think it works that way. So I'm not sure if, I'm sure that consent is the full answer here. So I think it is sort of, we need to keep that in the discussion, obviously, but maybe there is something else there that we need to look at. And at least when I'm thinking of those moments that have been most interesting, there has been trust, but there's also been sort of new people or new ideas or new something that has surprised me in in a way that I wasn't expecting, and that then leads to new thoughts.
If I can jump in super quick on the consent bit, just yeah, I have to agree that that's specific. That's not about emergent stuff. Like that is specifically about if you have realized how well these tools work for you, and you then start to systematically use it in ways that are more about your journey, perhaps than like you're taking your character arc in your real life, and you are kind of systematically exploiting other artworks to do that. And that's a really weird balance, because in some ways, of course, all art at all times we're doing that with. So to me, that this is about like edge cases rather than actual practices. Separately from that, I think, yeah, I'm sure you can intentionally design LARPs that are specifically made for, and where the agreement is very explicitly that you can bring your stuff, to work on.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to have all these answers. Maybe we will get the language one day. I guess we're working our way towards it, even if we're not there yet. And talking about the future, I would love to hear something about what you think is the cutting edge for using role-playing games as tools, or where are they going in the future for both personal or social change? Where is this heading? Alan, please.
So I've been playing with this in bits and pieces. So I'm currently teaching, I'm doing some social emotional learning workshops that are focused around games and play with teachers from the Chicago public school system. Focus on teachers who are teaching in spaces or using the games and the play to kind of to create community, to create safe spaces, build empathy, and then use those as playful parables, right, to kind of punctuate conversations. But I feel like what has been working for me, and I see more of it happening down the road, is that the focus has become less on making full-fledged game and more on taking the interesting pieces of play that work in like these kind of flash moments, and kind of elaborating on those pieces of play and using them to build conversations that kind of move on beyond the play. So an example of that is in intergroup, my game, which is a fate-based game. I have this this character creation process, which is it's called Winter Counts, which pulls from my cultural heritage. The structure for it is already existing fate-based structure for creating a character, but I just kind of elaborate on it, put some cultural tropes on it, and then once it was said and done, it was its own thing. And basically, it got people to walk through their life and think about these big moments in their life that stuck with them and just continue to affect them. And I wound up taking that out of the game and using it with the kids I work with the teachers I work with, to kind of walk through their life and kind of figure out where they've been, who they are, and what knowing do they now have to bring to any space that they come into. And as part of this process of getting people to think in less hierarchical terms of, like, leader versus followers, and more in these spaces of, there's no kings or queens. There's only world builders, there's only creators. And so we all have a creative piece to add to the puzzle. And so I would like to be able to do more of that kind of stuff. And I also recognize that when it comes to the larger gaming experience, not a lot of people know how to do that, right? Not a lot of people know how to create those spaces. They know how to make a straightforward story. They know how to run an adventure. They know how to do a LARP, but they don't necessarily know how to create that safe space and then extract the medicine out of it. And I feel like there's a capacity to start digging into more of the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis. They're already there in the games. Pull them out and bring them into more formalized therapeutic spaces, right? Because I feel like some of that that therapeutic space also brings with it an inherent permission to go into these deeper spaces. But there's also people who have had the background and the training to recognize when the heavy moment has hit, right? Or when a switch has been flipped, and they know how to stop and hold that space and help to move the person forward, help them kind of move through their distresses or what have you. So maybe an audit, right? Of like, what are the tools that are really working out there? What are the things that give those aha moments to people? And can we extract them a little bit from the game and then just turn them into just usable, tactile, tangible tools that we can move around into our bigger communal spaces, so they're actually coming out of the game and into the real world, but with an obvious use that has all these structures and rituals built around them to make them potent.
Thank you. Jaakko?
Yes, I'll follow up on that then and say I think that absolutely works, because in my professional, like in our consulting work with PDA, we are very like explicit to ourselves about the fact that everything we know about experience design, but everything, and ultimately everything we know about making humans safe and brave in rooms, or allowing them or carrying them sometimes through experiences, allowing them to create things together in different ways. Like all of that toolkit comes out of LARP design for us, and that's also how we motivate actually making LARP for LARPers still in the context, or like as an artistic practice within the context of our company, because we always talk about this is financial risks are ridiculous, obviously, but we say no, it's our R&D. Like we really do have to keep doing this because that is the only way we can learn about humaning. And then it's this idea of the LARP almost as a laboratory for human experience and the experiences of human interactions. And really, the whole other part of my job is in working with strategy and now in particular with sort of longer term macro level strategy in a sort of macro cultural context for the arts in Europe, in particular the screen industries, but also more broadly sort of public sectors and publicly funded spaces and processes. And now, because I have this double background, almost wherever I go, people want to talk to me about embodied futures. So people want to talk also this morning even I moderated a panel with some researchers about social imagination, like from so many different, but it can also be like on a board somewhere, and then people, what they want to talk about is like surely to understand other possible futures, solutions, anything except the apocalypse. It's not like it's so difficult to imagine that we're going to have to live it somehow. And in so many like very sort of businessy contexts, or like a museum working on their relationship to their audience, like big things, small things, massive things. What do we do with the public funding of the arts in Europe, which I'm having the privilege to work on, like long-term strategy things. Everywhere you go, people are saying, wouldn't it be great if there was some way to just visit these futures and feel them in your bones? Yes. That would be great. And I really do think, and it's people are doing those like embodied futures things. The work is being done by futurists, and some of those are obviously also LARP designers. But yeah, I think that is, I think if you get good at that stuff, you're never going to be out of a job, which is also a very rare thing to say for people who want to work with LARP.
Thank you. So, Diana, where are we going in the future?
I don't know, but I do want to name that there have been two things I've seen coming out recently, some because of the pandemic, some because of natural market pressures, but it seems like we have lots of activity on both ends of the class spectrum with LARP, or at least both ends of the cost spectrum, where we have the Star Wars LARP experience from Disney. We have luxury LARPs in, I believe, China that are, who knows what the price tag is for elites. But we also have, because of the pressures of the pandemic, the requirement that we must meet and LARP in virtual spaces, which are essentially free or very cheap, and by design cannot require housing, lodging, food, and set design and lighting costs. And so we've had to figure out how to do LARP in these extremely economically friendly spaces. And that itself reminds me of kind of the explosion of independent creators that Steam and other platforms for digital games offered, right? If you could put out these games that have very low budgets, then anybody essentially could tap into this and start creating. And that democratization is incredible and means that we're going to get more diverse voices and stories, but we also have the pressure on the other end. And I don't know what that's going to do, but I think it's important to think about in this. And then to speak to what Alan was saying, I think something I've been looking at or feeling on the horizon is especially with Indigenous ways of knowing, but other cultural concepts of play, not just what stories we tell, which I think is always like, we need more diverse stories in LARP is good. But I think the mechanics with which we tell them and the actual mechanisms of play that you were talking about, Alan, or other games where there's like dance magic that can be involved, which to me feels like a very quintessential Black experience in a LARP, right? Where we have that in, I'll put it in the chat. But so my point is that we're going to be seeing change from both directions, and I'm excited to see what it brings. Absolutely.
Thank you. Jaakko.
Something we've been talking about in the Nordic scene for a few years now, I think you touched on this in a lecture as well, is that sort of we have a fairly good grasp on the design part, but looking into sort of the player is something I think there's a lot to uncover there. And I think the player experience is something where much work needs to be done. And I think that is where interesting work will happen in the future. But the different player experiences, how are players using LARP? What is it that draws them there? What are they actually doing? What does it feel like? Those kinds of sort of, I think we need much more player research to fully understand the LARP experience, because it is often quite designer focused. I mean, obviously there is a lot of good work on players out there as well. I'm not saying that, but I think there's still much to uncover in that area.
Yes, Strix.
So I agree a lot with what you're saying. I think in terms of I'm going to use fancy partial words, the physio, psychological processes of LARP, I think we honestly are still stumbling around in the dark, along with the rest of the psychology community, actually. Psychology is a branch of science that is actually really poorly understood, like LARPing aside. And we don't really understand or have the language for, or the structures for how things work. I often use Jungian depth psychology as a scaffolding for me to begin to talk about these things academically and interpersonally. And there is a lot of work being done, especially headed up by Sarah and folks like her, to actually get this stuff out in the open and to begin to build an understanding and a knowledge base, and to continue to make our tools more sophisticated. But I think it is a really large unknown territory that will take many years to unravel, and our understandings will always be changing because we are always changing. Like, humans aren't stagnant as a species, and culture affects how we think and how we feel things. And we actually really don't understand the relationship between physiology and psychology very well yet either. Like, maybe the gut biome has something to do with all of this, right? We just don't know. And so I think we're really at the beginnings of this discipline as a whole, and we have a lot of work to do. That's what I think.
Yes, thank you. We can already see that we have a lot of work to do. Just from this conversation, we're like, we need to know all of these things. But Diana, you wanted to say something more? No? Yes? Maybe?
No, I will put, just to reiterate that I was talking about the Droid Auction, which is a game that I played at Living Games, actually, in which we had dance magic, that I thought was an amazing innovation in that. But I just had left my hand up. but forgot to take it down because I was searching that, but might as well tell you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, Alan.
There you go. So I just want to comment on what Diana was saying about partly the dance magic, because I have a LARP coming up where I'll be playing an NPC. It's kind of a, what's it called, Harry Potter-esque thing. It's called Albion, and I'm going to be one of the teachers in there. One of my goals was I've been poking around this idea of doing dance classes, somatic movement as you know, our one way of expressing magic. So I feel validated by hearing that. But the other thing that I think we often forget, and something also that Diana commented on, with my winter counts, there's this thought of a lot of our LARPing and our role-playing structure still comes out of a colonizer point of view. And from a person of Black and Indigenous heritage, finding more and more opportunities. I think a big future thing is finding more and more opportunities to kind of create mechanics, create scenes, create experiences that speak directly from those points of view, right? So it's like I would compare it to science fiction and fantasy, where damn near every apocalypse story you're going to come across is pretty much a privileged person's apocalypse. It's like, oh my God, they're taking my stuff, they're coming to get me. But then you go and you read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower, and it's very much not that kind of apocalypse, right? It's a slow growing thing that happens in bits and pieces, and freedoms disappear in small bits and pieces, and one day they're on the other side. But being on the other side is still looked at from the point of view of a queer Black person, right? And then the people in the ecology that they've built up. And these are things that there's a game I played with Menachem a while back. It's Dream. It's a queer game where you're playing a bunch of people who are living in a town that's outside of a bigger town. Yes, Dreams Askew. Thank you. And you know, I feel like what was great about that is that the point of view required you to shift your way of engaging the game and look at it from this marginalized space. So there was a little bit of that perspective taking going on. But once you did that, it completely changed the kind of mechanics that you wanted to engage. It could completely change the way you wanted to interact with everybody else. And I think that also happens when we have other games, even straight up fantasy and science fiction games that are coming from other cultural points of view that come from people within those cultures, as opposed to cultural point of views that have been collected by people outside the culture and said, you know, a la Legend of the Five Rings, and present it and kind of shoehorn back into that kind of old school mindset. So I think a large part of this growth needs to come from getting these other voices out there and figuring out ways to make tangible those voices and interactable those voices, so that we can actually have embodied lived experiences that help people who are on the outside of those experiences to realize there's more than just what they know. And I'm done.
Thank you. Strix, did you want to add something?
Nope, I just lowered my hand because I forgot it was up.
Okay. Well, we are right on time. The hour is already up. That just went shoo, at least for me. And now that I've been allowed to pick all of your brilliant minds for a while, I'm gonna let the audience also do this. So I just want to give a quick reminder to everyone. Please use the Q&A for questions. And we do not want questions asking presenter to evaluate a specific game. That's not what we're here about. So just wanted to say that. Yes, Diana, do you want to?
I would love to start answering Evan's question. the first one in the chat, because as a social psychologist, a social cognitionist, I'm here to tell you. So I will read the question for those who don't see it or can't read it, if that's okay.
Go
It's
ahead.
saying, I'm too excited. It's saying in 2011, we ran a solo RPG contest. There's a link in the chat, and there wasn't much traction in that space until 2019 when solo RPG design kind of exploded. 1,000-year-old vampires, wait for me. Many of your talks, however, emphasize that role-playing is a social activity. How do we, right, I should do it slower, right, because folks aren't English first language. Many of your talks, however, emphasize that role-playing is a social activity. How do we evaluate these solo RPGs in terms of your own conceptual models? Are they edge cases? So as a social cognitionist, we are engaged in social cognition all the time. Every decision and thought and feeling we have is attuned to social others, and the choices that we make are always in the context of either a selfhood or a group identity that we're immersed in at the moment based on cues in our environment. So for the first part, I would say absolutely, solo RPGs are not alone. You're doing those in a social context, in a social network. I think that for my particular research on role-playing as marginalized others, I think that that's very true, right? The idea is that if you're role-playing as a marginalized experience other than your own, you can't not be taking perspective and empathizing, or you're likely doing those things into someone else, an exemplar of another group that you're role-playing as, an example that you have either created in your head or plucked from lived experience, or an amalgamation, a summary of that group and its experiences, again, cobbled from what you've observed and also your stereotypes and expectations. All of this is rich social cognition, and it can be done in a way that's effective in terms of reducing prejudice or increasing empathy, while at the same time, as I argue, ineffective in terms of genuinely picking up on the lived experience of that marginalized identity. Because again, this is kind of rough, but garbage in, garbage out. If all you're using to craft your experience is what you've seen in the media and what you've learned from socialization, then it's not going to be authentic and genuine of the other person. So I'll leave it at that. But thanks for the question. I think it's a great one.
Thank you. Jok, please go ahead.
So maybe a same answer from a completely different direction. I've found in the last 2 years that it annoys me a little bit that we talk about role-playing, that it's, I mean, there are all kinds of really good historical reasons. And like 100 years later, we can't change the term anymore. But in these kinds of contexts, it's very helpful. I think it's helpful if we make distinctions between role play and character play, in the sense that the character, like to me, like, and I haven't thought deeply about this, but to me, like roles are social, they are relational. They are about agency and functions and in sort of social contexts. And one of the reasons why role-playing is so powerful is that humans are excellent at humaning, and we are very good. Therefore, like we are constantly playing roles in complex ways and trivial ways every day, and we're doing them in layered and simultaneous ways. And with the ability to move between those is, I don't know if it's intuitive, at least we practice it from before we have language. So it's like, you know, it's people are pretty good at this. And if you're playing complex characters, fictional characters, then of course a lot of that character portrayal is also about their roles. And that's why shallow characters, or like non-complex characters, where you actually maybe have like 2 lines of text and a couple of social relationships or functions, can work so incredibly well in role-playing that often that's enough, depending on the design and the thing. Still, when we think about transformation, we're thinking about like psychological, like immersion into another character, and this idea of like this placing yourself in a person with a completely separate autobiography and goals, and sometimes even, to the degree that we can, a very different psychology from our own, or very similar to our own, whichever it is. And then that there's something about the tensions and about like using that as a filter or an interface to the social roles and the agencies involved is kind of what I feel we do when we role play. And both of those things, I mean, I fully believe in what the Nordic LARPers call interimmersion, that a lot like that the role playing is happening when people are role playing at each other and with each other. So where is the, I don't know where the text is if we have one, but where the piece is, like where the LARP is in that mutual imagining. However, many times during role-playing and LARPing, those other people aren't actually there. That's why they don't have to be physically present. I just have to believe in them in the moment. And that means that, of course, I can also play single-player role-playing games where the other, like just none of them happen to be here in the room at this time, you know. And it doesn't, I don't think it changes what I do on my end at all. And I would not have given the same answer 20 years ago, I think. Because I would have thought that then I would have said, oh, of course you can roleplay alone, because it's about my power of conviction to talk myself into believing in this fiction and wallowing in my interesting emotions. No, it's just that I continue to have social roles in the world, even when I'm alone in a room. And that is true for my characters as well. Yeah.
Jaakko.
Yeah. It's weird. I mean, I'm in full agreement with Diane and York, but also I disagree. Because I do see it as a bit of an edge case. For me personally, the interesting thing in role-playing, be it tabletop or LARP, is in the social connection. Because that is the thing that feels most real in sort of in a world where sort of we can have any kind of a setting created for us, either from the real world also or from fantasy. And the thing that for me sort of grounds it is the connection between the human connection between the players. And specifically the thing that especially in LARP is important is the mirroring, the feeling seen when sort of you are playing something, but the other people are also playing that you are that something. And that is for me sort of, that is the most powerful thing in role playing. So while sort of I do think that sort of these kinds of solo experiences are extremely valid and useful, for me the sort of the biggest spark in role playing lies in the social connection.
Alan, do you want to follow up?
So let me lower my hand here. I guess my answer is more towards the latter part of the question, which was how do we evaluate the solo RPGs in terms of their own conceptual models? And I feel like maybe it comes with creating more of these solo experiences that have a documentation built into the process by default. So like, you know, places where you were required to kind of stop and you know, do a captain's log, right? Or you're required to kind of take notes of what's going on. I think so to like all those old things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and all these old stories where there's like this scientist who just keeps talking to himself all through the story, and they're cataloging things and wondering who actually does that. But creating these games, and I know people who've done this. I believe, I can't recall it off the top of my head, but my colleague Anna Anthropy has a couple games at least that do this kind of thing. But the idea being that there's an artifact that lives beyond the game, right? And with the artifact, not only can the player's results be examined, but a player who plays it multiple times can go back and see their own transformations over time, how they go about doing that kind of thing. And then I also would offer, there's this thing that, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Linda Barry. She's a comic artist. She teaches up at Wisconsin University or University of Wisconsin, I forget which way those words are arranged. But she has this great tool that I have used in my summer programs with kids, where part of it is just in the process of announcing you're here. Instead of doing a straightforward attendance, we draw a self-portrait. And every day there's a self-portrait over the course. And then at the end of it, I give people back the collection of all the portraits they've drawn, and they can see how their perception of themselves has changed over the course of the time that we've been playing games and doing things. Sometimes I'll even organize them into a poster so they can see the first one and the last one, and they can just take that poster home and look at it. But again, artifacts. I think there needs to be some some sort of artifact that comes out of that play space, so that it can be evaluated outside of the person who initially played it. If we're going to be able to register how well these solo games are working in relation to any of the conceptual models that we're talking about.
So following up on that then, yes, Jaakko, of course you're right, that the engine is this is going back to just like the construction of social reality, but you kind of need two people to do that social role. So there's something about duration here to me that it's very difficult to maintain. It becomes very complex if you have to play all the parts in your mind in a way to maintain those without that external enforcement. And also when we think about how depression or isolation affects us, that our social roles are, like during the pandemic, we've been broken down in a way by not being constructed by others all the time. Even people who have negative interactions often kind of probably find themselves missing those a little bit sometimes, right? But then it's so interesting, Alan, what you just said about the artifact, because maybe the artifact also becomes a way to a scaffold or like a tool to allow yourself a longer duration, because now you're in interaction with yourself through this tool.
Yeah, absolutely. As a response to that, I make these little introspective card tools for kind of having conversations with yourself. When I sit down with people to and have them play with the cards, the first thing I tell them is when you're done, I want you to take a picture of how you've arranged the cards, what spoke to you, and they also want you to make a journal entry or a piece of art or something in relation to your experience of it, and then come back and do it again, and then do it again, and then see, by the time you've done it 3 or 4 times, you're not seeing things the way you were seeing them the first time you arranged those pieces. So persistence and iteration and being able to examine that stuff.
Thank you. I would love to hear your take on this, Strix, since you have talked to us a lot about specifically ensemble, and now we're talking single.
Yeah, so I think there is a difference, and this might be another place where our sophistication of understanding could be failing us. I will just posit that that's possible. When I think about solo RPGs, my brain goes in a very different direction, and it becomes much more specifically an imaginal play in the way that Jung and a lot of other psychologists thought about it early on, which is your imagination is creating structures through which you navigate, and you can learn transformational things, but it is not intrinsically social. So I think it's actually like a different pathway, one that's just as effective sometimes, and it looks a lot like the social ones, but I think there are different mechanisms happening in the same way that, like, you maybe read a novel and you have an imaginal experience with the novel, which is a solo thing, or any other piece of media which you are taking on by yourself. It also conjures up in me actually old ideas that I had when I was much earlier in my own thinking about the intersection between, LARPs and mythology and play and meaning, and that is the idea of possession in the religious sense, not of demons and stuff, but like people being possessed by their gods or by spirits around them in their environment, and then taking on the role of that spirit. But everything about that is internal. Sometimes it's performative. You're doing that for an audience, or you're doing it for your religious community. Sometimes it's just a practice that you practice with yourself. And I know we are very afraid sometimes to bring in religious studies to these conversations. It makes us all very nervous. But again, I think that these other processes around us in different cultural environments and contexts, we can learn from and bring into our understanding of what these things are. So yeah, I don't think they're the same. I think they're adjacent, and I am curious to discover like what's actually underneath all of that material when we can get into it.
Thank you. Okay, we will move on to the next question. And this is maybe a question about documentation. We have a question here. I agree we need more research on players, but how do we do the research? Would detailed diaries help? So maybe what can role players do to help this happen? To find the answers.
Reflect a lot. Just, I mean, it's helpful if everybody does it in the same way, but stop and think about what it is. I think one of the best, most insightful things that we were at a retreat, like a theory retreat, and I think it was Eirik Fatland who was it, and maybe misattributing it because it's always him, but somebody ran like an exercise that was thinking about why it sucks to begin LARPing. Jaakko might remember who it was.
It was Eirik.
Yes, of course. So basically the exercise was, think of a LARP, like the last LARP you played. Think about where you were 5 minutes before runtime started and how did it feel and what were you doing? And then think about what you were doing 5 minutes after runtime started. And what were you doing and how did it feel? And then we all just sat down and just like described it like in as much detail as we could from completely different LARPs as well. And we learned so much. We learned so much from just one single exercise of like 8 people in a room. And I think we can apply that, just think specifically and share and discuss, oh, this is what happens to me. We learn about play styles, we learn about so many things. And that doesn't require, and I mean, that's because it's also, I mean, yeah, detailed diaries would be wonderful, but then then producing them changes play as well. So.
Jaakko?
Yeah, I think sort of the thing that players can do is honesty. And I think that was what Eirik Fatland was going for sort of with this exercise, was to sort of that, just look at the specific moment without preconception and or try to sort of talk about it in an honest manner. Because something that at least sort of I notice in those role-play culture that I am a part of is that we have all kinds of ideas of what it's like to play. And then when our experiences don't fit that, we ignore it, or we think that something is wrong. We don't actually look at the thing. I played recently, like last week, 2 weeks ago, in a LARP called The Future is Straight, about sort of XK conversion camps, and very sort of a heavy LARP. And I was expecting to feel really bad afterwards. And I actually felt warm and fuzzy like the 2 days after it. And it took me, I had to talk to someone and reflect about it to recognize this feeling that I was having in my body, because it went against the expectations in our culture, in our play culture, about what it is like to be after participating in a sort of a striking, taxing, insightful, meaningful experience for 3 days. So sort of having the strength and honesty to look at your own experience and talk about it openly, even if it questions the sort of the cultural understanding or the social understanding. I think that's one thing to do. Observation, interview, player journals, all of these things I think are needed. So I think social sciences has a great tool kit for us to work with. It's just sort of, we need to do the work.
I think there's this mechanic that I see in a lot of reality shows, where every now and then they pull someone aside and they kind of give a quick interview about like what they were doing and why they were doing a thing, how it felt, and what they think is going to happen from it. And in addition to things like diaries and getting players to somehow publish their experience, I think working something like that into your campaign, into your game, so it's like, you know, you have listeners, and there's something that players are expected to do, like a confessional booth or something every now and then that they go to kind of unload. But with the idea that this stuff is being captured, and then we can go back and look at it, because again, it's about being able to go back and look at the artifact, right? Having different types of artifacts, but I think it's important to have artifacts that don't feel like we're they feel like they're part of the experience. They don't feel like they're subtracted from the experience, right? Because when they're when they're kind of outsiders looking in, gathering the information, that changes how we interact with them, right? We don't give that honest evaluation of our experience because now we're on stage, as opposed to when we're in a moment in character and we're in our fields, and then we're required to go off and kind of engage the thing. It's so much, I think there's so much more of an authentic experience that is translated in that kind of a moment.
You know, I was literally thinking about this after Knutepunkt, the conference this year, in response to some completely different problem that I know that now don't remember what it was, but I thought that the only way I could figure out to get the information would be to run a LARP, like, and in this case it was about like big LARPs. You'd be running like a multi-day event of, let's say, at least 30 people, but you do it with the understanding that this is actually also a research project. Like, you'd probably get a LARP that's like well tested and so on, so you don't have a lot of confusion about that. And you just build into the contrast that at any given time, you know, basically like a whistle goes off and you freeze wherever you are, and everybody, I don't know, picks up their cell phone and something and reports the answer to whatever the question was. And then like 5 minutes later, but like you don't stop, and you know, you do the thing, everybody's phones are gathered or whatever, and then the whistle goes again, and you continue play, because we know, unrelatedly, we do this for safety and all kinds of things, that afterwards, this isn't, I mean, if you're in flow, yeah, it might be a little bit weird, but we all actually know from experience, it's not going to break your LARP. Like, afterwards, all of that's going to be edited out, so it's going to be completely coherent to you. And if it is very big, it's not going to be a bigger disturbance, especially when you're used to the practice, than a calibration break would be, which is nothing at all. Probably it allows you to catch your breath and go harder when you go back in. So I think it would be like a win-win scenario, and LARPers are fascinated by LARP. So I'm sure it'd be possible to find people to do this, especially if you could run like an expensive LARP cheaper, because there was also research funding. You see, I designed this process in my mind, and I don't know what it was for. So now let's do it for this, right?
I love that. And as you're saying that, I just got this image in my head of like a LARP design with like a little companion character. And you know, maybe it's a place you put your phone, or maybe it's it's just like a device that already has, it's a dumb device, already has like some app in it that you report to, but it's a thing that's it's like your familiar, right? And you get to talk to your familiar all the time, but all that stuff is captured, and then someone else on the back end gets to pull it all together and make it into something that is researchable or things that people can dig through. But yeah, that's really exciting.
That's great. We don't have a lot of time left, but I would love to just have one takeaway thought from the day from each of you before we are done here. From all of the discussions we've had, I give you a little while to.
Because I can jump in there. I think my big takeaway, and something I hadn't really thought much of until we started having the conversation here, is that so much of what we do in role-playing game spaces is like this ephemeral magic, right? It happens, it's awesome, if we're doing it, and then it's over. And then we can talk about it like our war stories, but we're not necessarily doing a great job of capturing those experiences so that we can actually really look at what's working and what's not working. So that inspires me to want to start coming up with more both rituals and mechanics that can be built into an experience that allows people to do personal evaluations, do group evaluations, do long-term evaluations over the course of longer games, so that we can see the transformations as they're happening. I think that's a big win if we can pull that off.
Thank you. Strix?
So for me, I think my takeaway personally is I don't want LARP to be medicalized in the way that other things have been medicalized in the past. Alan is right. This art form is actually magic. And I mean that seriously in some ways, in the way that shamanism is magic and a lot of other practices are magic, in that if we medicalize it, we will kill a part of it. And I think that there's a distinction that I want to make clear between, entering the great unknown and really understanding what we're doing and taking it to a place where capitalism gets its claws in it real deep and it's changed in a way that doesn't serve us anymore. So that's my parting thought.
Thank you.
I just want to say yes. And nothing that kills the trickster in the game, nothing that kills the mystery in the game. We have to keep that alive, because that's where the crux of it happens. So I'm hardly in agreement with Strix on that.
And my takeaway, or like things that I've thought of today that I've never thought of before, which is very weird since I think about LARP literally every day, is this idea that stuff that worked before we knew how complex or risky it was might be inherent to the form. Like, hang on, wait a minute. Like there might be some clues here to stuff that I've never thought about before. The other is this idea that was suggested by everything we've talked about LARPing as a kind of strict discipline of transcendence, or it's doing this work together to be in this very, very, that has this something dervish-like quality, or that this combination of discipline and freedom and creation, and that there's to think about the act of LARPing during runtime as a kind of practice, that there's something there that shifts my perspective entirely from how I've been thinking about this for the last 25 years. So thank you. This has been a very transformative panel for me. And the Strix, what you just said about those things, like what they can't take, can't be medicalized, and it can't be owned by capital. And that connects to both of these two insights, I think, because some of it can be exploited by people. I think I'm expecting the Star Wars things to be really shit, to be honest, not because the people aren't skilled, but because of the limitations of their business model and format and participation practices and law. But even so, they might also feel magical because some of that magic is inherent to LARP. But the thing that they won't ever get, like the thing they can't take from us, is that disciplined practice of this collective, like transcendent practice of very complex exploration, narrative or otherwise, together. So I think that part might be safe.
My takeaway kind of comes from the beginning when we were all talking about our own transformational experiences, which is that people have very different goals, interests, and things that they get out of their transformational play. Even when we're talking about the same thing, we had so many different ideas that we touched on, and comfort levels with going there in different areas. And I want to, you spoke about the Star Wars LARP. I think what's exciting about that is that we might get a whole bunch of new players, people who, and it's a little bit, maybe there's some fear there, right? If somebody comes to LARP by virtue of engaging in this big mega corporate LARP, but I don't think having new people come in with new ideas is always going to be a bad thing. I think that could bring in fresh perspectives, fresh ideas about what transformational play could look like. So the more voices we have in the room, the more complexity there is there, both from the side of what are you getting out of LARP, but also what are you still afraid to let LARP do for and to you. And I think that's fascinating. So thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, I got nothing. I'm just sort of thinking that sort of as a heightened form of being and doing in the world, LARP is, I mean, for me, like I said, it's about the connection between people, and that sort of being seen and doing things with other together in a way that is sync, but also surprising, that there is play happening there that has the spark, or at least the potential of spark that is the magic. And sort of when we are meeting in LARP with other people, possibly with masks of different types, what sort of everybody is bringing themselves, and they are also sort of bringing their baggage as well, and then sort of, I think, sort of dealing with that baggage in a way that is useful and safe enough for everyone is I think why we're here. It is a little bit frightening, but it's also the thing that I think makes it interesting, sort of meeting people and seeing them in this fictional context. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. It's been absolutely amazing to be here with you and hear all your thoughts and ideas and see the magic happen in the room, even if it's a digital room. So I just want to give the greatest thanks from all of us in the Transformative Play Initiative to our lovely panel. And I also want to give a big thank you to all the viewers and all the participants who are here being active in the chat and asking questions. And I want to make sure to mention that if you want to see more of this magic happen, make sure you follow us on Facebook and on YouTube, where you will find us if you just search for Transformative Play Initiative. We also have an email list you can sign up to if you want to know when things happen. You can either find that through Facebook or YouTube, or you can Google Uppsala University and Transformative Play Initiative and click your way from there. Our next event is December the 7th, and that is going to be a town hall event. That means we will have some shorter presentations, and then we will have discussions in smaller groups around the topic that was just presented. So it's a possibility to have a bit more interaction and to actually network with other participants that are interested in this subject. The short videos will then be shared on YouTube, but the discussion in the little groups will not be. So then you have to make sure that you are actually there so you don't miss out on that opportunity. And on that note, I wish you all a lovely night, and I hope you will have more magic in all of your lives. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.